Hello, everybody. We are back to the Financial Times' best business books of the year. There are 6 on the list. We've done 4 shows, actually. One with Michael Morris, the author of Tribal. Another with Daniel Susskind, the author of Growth. Andrew Scott's been on the show a couple of times. And we do, in fact, have an upcoming show with Parmi Olsen, the author of Supremacy. But today we're talking Unit X with my 2 guests, Raj M. Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff. It's interesting. A few weeks ago, I was in London and I went into the offices of the Financial Times to talk to Andrew Hill, who organizes the list. And we talked about what exactly a business book is. Unit X is not a traditional business book, or at least it's not written as a traditional business book. And our 2 authors, Raj M. Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff, aren't traditional business book authors. They're both joining us today. Chris is on the North Shore, I think, in Maryland. He normally lives in San Francisco. And Raj is talking to me from Noe Valley, just a mile or 2 away from my home in Ashbury Heights. Raj or Chris, perhaps you might talk about whether you see Unit X as a traditional business book. Were you surprised when it appeared as one of the top 6 books of the year for the Financial Times in its business category?
Well, Andrew, great to be here with you. I mean, obviously, we're very humbled to be considered to be in the top 6 of the books by the Financial Times. But to your question of is it a business book? I mean, I think that even harkens back to what we were discussing, right? The topic of Unit X was this organization that Chris and I had the opportunity to lead that was transforming the Pentagon and how it does business and how it operates as a bureaucracy. And of course, it's in the business of deterring war or winning them if it need be. So, really the underlying story is how do you change large organizations? How do you change the way that incentives and people act? And so I think that is relevant to large business organizations around the world. And so we're glad to be considered in that lot.
Yeah, I actually meant it as a compliment. I think the fact that your book showed up, which may or may not be a business book in a business book competition, actually speaks highly of the book. Chris, Unit X is not written as a traditional business book. You're not a couple of professors in some business school somewhere writing about the world. You actually participated in this. Tell us about, maybe we'll begin with Chris and then Raj, who's perhaps in some ways even more central figure in the book. Tell us about your role or your identity in this Unit X experiment.
Sure, Andrew. I came of age in the Pentagon as a national security aide, working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then later at the White House. And in my time there as a staffer, technology loomed increasingly more importantly in how the military was going to continue to secure its advantage. And indeed, technology was changing so rapidly that the Secretary of Defense, Raj and I both worked under Ash Carter, noticed that the Pentagon was quite rapidly drifting out of date and that big changes were to come. And so I had worked on technology issues for quite some time. And when it came time to found Unit X, Secretary Carter turned to me and then to Raj and paired us together. One person having a great military background, but also had made their career in Silicon Valley. The other had made their career me in the Pentagon. So that's how the 2 of us got introduced to the idea of helping launch the Pentagon Silicon Valley office.
Raj, the FT review begins with a pre-dawn patrol over the skies of Iraq in 2006. And at that point, you weren't a DC operative. You were a 27-year-old US Air Force captain. Tell us about yourself and your own relationship with this Unit X experiment.
Sure. I was just a mere instrument of policy back then. Look, Andrew, I've lived sort of both sides of the problem that Chris and I were charged to solve. In 2006, I was on my first combat deployment in an F-16, and it was, troubling to see that the wonderful airplane I had did not have a moving map GPS, whereas a consumer handheld device that same year would. And so there's a real divide between this pace of software in Department of Defense versus the commercial sector. Fast forward 10 years, I've started my first company. It's focused on cybersecurity and protecting large enterprises. In fact, my team was from the government. And our investors at the time recommended us not to sell to government because it was too hard and too slow. And so, again, we were charged to bridge the divide. So young innovators, young companies, particularly again, when you think about software and analytics, will want to work on national security and helping to preserve democracy.
Chris, the subtitle of the book is How the Pentagon and Silicon Valley Are Transforming the Future of War. We think about, as Raj touched on, we think about the Pentagon and Silicon Valley in very dramatically different terms. The Pentagon is a vast, often indecipherable bureaucracy. Silicon Valley is against bureaucracy. There aren't bureaucrats here. They're just investors and entrepreneurs. Firstly, is that a fair observation? Talk a little bit about the origins then of Unit X. Who championed it, and how did your kind of innovation, your Silicon Valley mentality, find itself in Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon?
I think that Washington and Silicon Valley really are two different planets, so to speak, with different species that live on them. They really are different worlds, and the challenge became in 2015 is the two worlds had really grown apart, and we're producing technology in completely different ways. And we illustrate this by the cover of the book, which shows an F-35 fighter aircraft, the world's most fighter aircraft, on top of an iPhone. And that F-35 was which is unquestionably the best fighter aircraft in the world today, stealthy, sensor fusion. It was designed in the 1990s. Its design was actually frozen in the late 90s. It began production in 2001. It didn't begin flying until 2016. It became fully operational in the year 2016 when Raj and I took over the helm of DIU. So in that time, technology, civilian technology produced by the $25 trillion global consumer technology market had really moved on. So you get to the year 2016, and the processor powering the F-35 is 100 times slower than what we have in the modern iPhone. And more than that, companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they each had a market capitalization larger than the entire defense sector combined. So what used to be the main show in the Cold War, government R&D, defense contractors, actually had become a sideshow when it comes to innovation. There were many more people innovating in the commercial world. And so DIU was an office that was meant to rejoin those two ecosystems, not only in the technology that was being used, but also in ways of working.
So, and just for the clarity of our audience, you talk about the DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit, which is what Unit X is all about. It's a very Silicon Valley endeavor, Raj, isn't it? I mean, Steve Jobs did it. You find a group of smart, young innovators, troublemakers, people who don't conform, and you throw them in the deep end. You give them a building. They wave, in the Jobs case, a pirate flag. And the whole point of the enterprise is to blow up tradition. Is that the story of the Defense Innovation Unit that you participated and led?
Certainly in the early days, there was a charge to do things differently, move very quickly. But ultimately, the mission was, how do you transform the Pentagon, the US government, even allied governments, of how you work with this new sector, right? Can you create a small, safe moat to experiment with new processes, new approaches? And those that work can now scale. One particular example of that is
and that, of course, sorry to jump in, Raj.
Yeah, of course.
Even the word scale probably is a word that most traditional Pentagon people would look at you blankly at. Of course, it's a religious word in Silicon Valley.
Of course. You grow what works. One of the core problems was, again, the speed of acquisition, of buying things, right? So a Valley startup needs to show progress every 18 months to raise its next round of financing, and the Pentagon would normally take 3 to 4 years to buy anything. So it just was a mismatch. There was a young woman on our team who, by reading through the 1,000-page law, discovered that Congress had given the department a new way to buy things quicker. And she helped design and build something that took that 4-year process, made it into 60 to 90 days. And now, 10 years later, the department has put $70 billion worth of procurement through this new vehicle. So again, it shows something that we piloted, it worked, and then enabled the department to do it more broadly. So it's less to disrupt the whole thing, but show the art of possible.
Chris, I talked about Jobs, of course, at Apple. Who was the champion within the Pentagon of the Defense Innovation Unit, what you call DIU? Was there a particular general who got it, or did this come from outside the Pentagon?
Oh, what's interesting is, all the top generals got it. But in the Pentagon, very few people actually have a lot of authority. It really does take the secretary to move the department to a new place. And we were very lucky as a nation that Ash Carter happened to be the secretary at this moment. Because back when he was a professor in 2001, he spotted this divergence. The key trend that was diverging that was important was the R&D trend. At the end of the Cold War, thinking we had a peace dividend, we stopped essentially making larger investments in defense science technology. And so that entire world, which, DARPA, the military labs, which had brought us the internet, stealth, many other inventions, GPS, essentially flatlined at the exact moment that the technology ecosystem took off and grew into the enormous engine it is today. And so he already saw in 2001 that the department would at some point in the near future need to pivot completely to the commercial sector and become, in his words, used in 2001, a fast follower of commercial innovation, because that's where the locus of innovation would be. So when he became Secretary of Defense in 2015, he moved quickly to pivot the department on a number of fronts towards the world of commercial technology.
Raj, when you step back and look at this thing historically, perhaps it's less surprising, given that, as most historians of the internet argue, the internet itself came out of the military-industrial complex. We never would have had it without the money that came from the Cold War, which went into the investment in networks, and out of that we got the internet and the World Wide Web. So when one stands back, perhaps it's not quite as surprising as it might initially seem. Is that fair?
I mean, if you look back at the history of Silicon Valley, it was founded on supporting the U.S. Department of Defense and the government, right? Some of the earliest research here was to help solve the radar problem in World War II, and the German fighters going to the UK.
Yeah, and who was the guy who actually solved that radar? I've forgotten his name, but he was a yeah, and the whole idea of cybernetics grew out of that.
That's right. And then there was so there's been countless examples of that from the Cold War, and I think for a host of reasons, both philosophical, stemming from the Vietnam War, to just business, right, where the Pentagon is no longer the monopsony buyer, the biggest acquirer of this technology. They've drifted, but I think it's very heartening to see it come back together. You see young entrepreneurs say, look, defending democracy in this American experiment is a worthwhile one. It's interesting and challenging problems, and world events just over the last few years have brought that into stark contrast.
Chris, Raj noted heartening for some, but for others it's horrifying. Silicon Valley was driven by the counterculture, by guys like Jobs and many others who stood against war, who stood against violence, were often hostile in some ways to the American state. Did Unit X experience that kind of hostility in your conversations with Silicon Valley companies? Did they shy away from associating with the Pentagon?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, of course, right? I mean, the hard power of the military is its own thing, right? And so walking that into a Silicon Valley, around 2015, when the world was, relatively placid, right? And it's sunny in California. So it's not surprising.
Always sunny in California, Chris, until it rains, right? That famous song, till it pours.
And so people come to the Valley to join the tech industry to make world-changing products that are going to transform how we live and work. They don't necessarily come to Silicon Valley to make the world a more lethal place. And so it takes a bit of explaining, I think, to unroll the chain of logic, which is sure. I mean, the weapons that are in the world today are horrific things, and they do awful things to humans. But by having them, by deterring war at a time of increasing volatility, you're actually performing an incredible service. And that conversation for us, for Raj and I, actually was a very high-pitched conversation because we entered the valley in the years after Edward Snowden, where there was, in the years after the Iraq War, after a lot of people being very frustrated with the U.S. drone campaign abroad, there were a lot of legitimate reasons why people in Silicon Valley would not want to hear two guys from the military say, "Hi, I'm here from the government. I want to help." But if you fast forward to today, and I'm sure, Andrew, you've experienced this living out in San Francisco, it's just a completely different conversation where, we now have 10,000 North Korean troops as we speak going to war, in Europe, right? We have the Middle East in a completely precarious situation. We have China rising and being quite bellicose. So I think people now just watching the news, their minds have moved into a different place than it was when we arrived in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll talk about that later, Chris. I have to admit, I'm not entirely convinced by that argument. Raj, did you see different responses from different kinds of Silicon Valley companies? There seems to be a cleavage now between conservatives, people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and a more traditional liberal class, perhaps represented by companies like Google, whereas Thiel, of course, is one of the founders of Palantir, which seems to be the pin-up defense technology company. In UnitX, do companies like Google and Palantir, do they represent extremes of how they responded to the Defense Innovation Unit?
It's always a journey to get to where we are today. And so if I would think back about that journey, I would say there was a small vocal minority that had philosophical issues of working with the Department of Defense, right? And low levels of trust and understanding. And we saw some of that occur at Google. But I think if you look today, most of those philosophical differences are gone, right? If you think about all the large technology businesses, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Palantir, SpaceX, they all are increasing the level of work with the government. They have publicly expressed desire to work more closely with the government and solve its problem sets. And I think the real reticence, at least at the senior corporate levels, was less philosophical, but more just business, right? The government was just so hard to work with that it didn't make sense relative to the other opportunities. And so I think this trend of them getting closer, is a good one. And I think what I think people here in the Valley are starting to appreciate is, the government doesn't do everything right and companies don't do everything right, but at least we do it transparently and openly, which is very different than our adversaries or potential adversaries that very much work in a closed society where there is no opportunity for the public to understand, comment, or influence.
Chris, it's easy to understand what Silicon Valley brings the government in terms of learning, innovation, speed, openness of thought. How do you think the Pentagon, kind of qualities or values do you think that the Pentagon, in the experience of the Defense Innovation Unit, brought Silicon Valley? How did it perhaps help Silicon Valley grow up, if that's the right metaphor to use?
Well, 2015 was sort of the year of sushi delivery apps, right? I mean, every new business was trying to find some way of making life a little bit more convenient. And when you sit with members of the uniformed military who have sworn an oath, right, to obey the Constitution and as Raj did, actually go to war if the policymakers and the politicians tell them to, and you learn what they actually face day to day, it's a very eye-opening experience. I mean, one example, I taught college for a semester after I stepped down from DIU, and I took my undergraduates. The nearest base I could find was a Coast Guard unit in Boston. This is a bunch of young Harvard kids. And it was astonishing to see them interact with people in uniform and understand the risks and the challenges that they face. And so that conversation was a fascinating one to watch unfold. We helped entrepreneurs at DIU in our first year there work on challenges like detecting North Korean missiles, getting autonomous aircraft to be able to deliver troops safely to a covert battle space. Really interesting, hard problems that, especially in 2015, 2016, were very far away from sushi delivery apps.
Raj, when one again steps back, it seems, particularly with organizations like SpaceX and the decline of funding and significance of traditional government organizations like NASA, that that private companies driven by remarkably innovative, dynamic, controversial figures like Elon Musk are replacing the government. Is there any truth in that? Do we see the emergence of a military industrial privatized complex that can survive independently of Washington, D.C.?
This is a really interesting question, Andrew, as we watch many of these companies get built and create just amazing technologies and capabilities that most thought not possible just a few years ago. And so I think this is something that, again, with open public discourse, we're going to have to work through. How do we work with these young companies? We need them. What are the right relationships and encouragement of freedom, yet guardrails between the government and the private sector? There's some things that will be inherently governmental, right? Decision to go to war, prosecute war, those are very much government decisions. But if we think about where are the best engineers, what's made this country great, and what we should do as we think about the rise of authoritarianism, is to double down on our strength, which is the free flow of people and the free flow of capital. And this is not like a new challenge. We've seen these in World War II and the Cold War, but it's just different, and it's something we're all going to have to work through.
But it's all very well talking about that free flow. You guys did it. You have military backgrounds, but the traditional Silicon Valley engineer or business person or startup entrepreneur, they're not going to take Pentagon style wages, are they? I mean, isn't it hard to get people to leave sunny San Francisco or the Bay Area and go and live in foggy, chilly Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, but I don't think you need to serve, right? There's lots of ways to serve and to be supportive without signing up full time and enlisting in the military, ranging from being an advisor, working at a company on these important problem sets, to joining a reserve unit. The government has never built its own fighter jets or satellites or ships in our entire history, and so there've been great servants of the public need that have worked in private corporation. Again, that is the American way rather than state-owned enterprise.
Chris, how would you respond to an entrepreneur, an engineer listening to your guys read Unit X and think and say, I don't want to have anything to do with war. I don't consider the Chinese enemies. I don't want to be involved in any war in Ukraine. The purpose of my life is to create technologies or products that benefit mankind, and that I certainly don't want my technology associated with American bureaucrats talking about a defense of American democracy. We did that in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and they've always been disastrous.
Yeah, that is certainly a point of view, and people that choose to sort of disengage in that way are free to do that and find a sushi delivery company to work at. There's plenty of them, but
Well, are you
I think
suggesting it's either sushi delivery companies or war? Isn't there something in between?
there certainly is, and the incredible thing about inventing technology, right, is the way technology gets invented inevitably involves a lot of encoding in it of ways of working. In fact, encoding morality right into how machines work themselves, and so technologists that are closest to the technology, I think, have an incredible both personal responsibility and opportunity to voice concerns, to work collaboratively in ways to actually make better technology that is on the whole safer and more responsible to use. So I love the fact that Silicon Valley has woken up in the last decade to the fact that social networking technology, for instance, has political consequences not only in our own country but around the world, and how you design it and operate it matters. So this moral conversation about how we use technology, I think, benefits the department, and hopefully is something that a lot of people in Silicon Valley are excited to participate in.
Raj, your co-author Chris talked about something called encoding morality. That might inspire some, others it would be a rather chilling term, and it points to the importance of AI. Two questions here. Firstly, how important is AI in the Unit X narrative, and in terms of this new relationship between Pentagon? I was going to say Pentagon Valley, the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. Maybe now we should call it Pentagon Valley. And can or should indeed this technology be an attempt to encode morality, whatever that means?
Yeah. So, artificial intelligence, we're still in the early innings of it, but it is showing that it's going to transform how enterprises operate, how militaries will function, and it will impact our individual lives, right? It is one of these epochal technology changes. And while it would be nice, perhaps, in the mind of some engineers to totally separate the impacts of AI from national security matters and say this is completely separate. But the problem is that's not fully in their control, and adversaries have a vote. So if folks that don't believe in our sort of liberal Western values of borders and self-determination decide to use this technology to invade their neighbors or enable themselves their neighbors, I think it's difficult to just say, well, that's not my problem and I'm going to sit it out. And again, these are not new problems, right? When the airplane was invented, it wasn't just used for transport. It transformed World War I and World War II. Same with gunpowder. So and steam engine. So I think it's a little naive to say it doesn't matter, and to be part of that conversation and shape it to ensure the values that we as a nation collectively, and we do it through our votes, right? Espouse. It's important to have a voice.
Chris, the book came out in July of this year, so it was written before July. You end the final chapter focuses on Ukraine. Where is Unit X, or the arguments in Unit X in the struggle in Ukraine? Of course, one of the debates in the election in the US is between perhaps a more aggressive or traditionally aggressive America involvement in foreign wars and the Trumpian isolationism in which wants to step back from these kind of wars. Why is Ukraine so significant in terms of the narrative in Unit X?
Well, Ukraine is the culmination of trends that, again, Ash Carter first spotted and that we studied very carefully. So, today in Ukraine, we have delivered 31 of the most advanced battle tanks in the world, the M1A1 Abrams tanks. And the Ukrainians, for the last 6 months or so, have been operating them against the Russians. And so many of them have been destroyed by inexpensive Russian kamikaze drones that the Ukrainians have had to pull them back from the front lines. So this is astonishing, right? I mean, mechanized warfare, man-mechanized warfare, the tank has been around since World War I when it replaced the cavalry. And right now, if I were a Western military, I would not be buying tanks any longer. So what we're seeing in Ukraine, but also the Middle East, frankly, and other places in Africa, as drone warfare advances, particularly AI-enabled drone warfare, we're seeing incredible paradigm shifts in military technology. And the concern now, I mean, the Pentagon is beginning to realize this, but is the Pentagon moving quickly enough to get ready for a future war that's happening far faster than many people ever imagined?
Raj, the other war, of course, of 2024 is the war in Gaza and the Middle East. Israel is a very interesting model. Is Unit X, or was Unit X in some ways an attempt to replicate the Israeli model?
I don't know if we were trying to replicate anyone else's model. I mean, the Pentagon is the world's largest bureaucracy with 3 million people. And so I think our view was, what are other approaches from around the world and even in our history that has helped, bridge divides? Because ultimately these things, Andrew, are human endeavors, right? You look at all these organizations; they're not, nameless faces. There's people running them. And so, like to Chris's point, part of the challenge is that many of the natural bonds that we had between these two worlds, and the permeability has gone away, right? If you look at Congress, I think 45%. If you go to 1980, 45% of members of Congress had served in uniform in the government. Now we're less than 10%. Even more stark if you looked at Fortune 500 CEOs. And as Chris described, we've basically shuttered our active duty bases in all major metropolitan parts, probably for good reason, mostly cost. But history has shown if you have a body politic that's separate from its citizenry, that's not a good outcome. So trying to bring these people together and whatever tools we could do to do that, we endeavor to do so.
Chris, you talked about one country invading another and America's responsibility, perhaps, to make sure that doesn't happen. How central is the question of China and Taiwan in your thinking and in the thinking of Unitex?
It's incredibly central. I mean, the last chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who stepped down about a year ago, is fond of reminding all of us that nobody in uniform today has ever lived through total war, right? That in the years between the First World War and the conclusion of the Second, 130 million people perished. And so we as advanced technological societies that have even more destructive tools today than anybody had then, ought to at all costs endeavor to avoid total war. And I think today it's not unreasonable to look at China, and particularly the Taiwan scenario, as the possible start of a total war that would be horrific for everybody. And so understandably, those of us that are national security professionals are very focused on how to deter such a conflict.
I mean, given the intimacy, perhaps, of Chinese private companies, innovation, and the state and the military, was that an argument being used in the formation of Unitex, that if the Chinese are doing it, we should too, we Americans? Chris?
Sure. So in 2015, the year that DIU got started, the Chinese actually had moved much more aggressively already to make full use of the commercial technology revolution by Xi issuing a proclamation called Civil Military Integration that mandated any Chinese technology company make all of its technology available to the People's Liberation Army. And in fact, if their technology proved to have a battlefield use, oftentimes a military officer or a party member would join the board of that company. So that's the Chinese way of deliberately harnessing the commercial technology to bring their military not only to parity with the United States, but to be more effective with the United States military in scenarios that are of national concern to them.
Raj, a few weeks ago, we did a show on CRISPR, the technology that is revolutionizing the biotech business, and how we quote unquote engineer human beings. In our conversation, the guest talked about what's happening in China and North Korea and Russia, that some of this technology might be being used. There's no proof, but there are rumors of creating new kinds of human beings that don't feel pain. We talked earlier about North Korean troops now in Ukraine. How close are we to this science fictional world where foreign governments will be manufacturing forms of life that is designed to fight in wars?
It's a great question, one I'm probably not technically equipped to answer.
Well, your sense, I mean, you read science fiction and you're in this space.
Yeah, as someone that had to drop out of pre-med in undergraduate, I'm I'm a ways away from it. But I think it goes to your point. Look, all the advent of technology is going to continue, and every new development has both risks and positives, right? This technology that CRISPR is unleashing is going to open up a new way to treat cancer, right, and have targeted therapeutics. On the other hand, it has risks around a new form of eugenics. I think we have to be open. We have to think about where our ethical lines are, and where are we going to help steer. But we can't stick our heads in the sand and just wish it not to happen.
Chris, you
Andrew,
mentioned the First World War. Sorry.
Yeah, Well, I just say that, your CRISPR story illustrates, the new strategic reality of commercial technology, right? It used to be because the government labs were 5 or 6 generations ahead of what other people were producing, whether it was a biological application or microelectronics. The government had a heck of a lot more control over how technology progressed, when it was allowed out to be broadly distributed in commercial markets. And today, the reverse is true. The reason why people are worried about CRISPR is that the cost of advanced biological synthesis has dropped to the point that the three of us could spend $10,000 in eBay and start doing CRISPR in our garage, right? And that unlocks a much more dangerous world, even as it unlocks incredible opportunity. And so militaries around the world are now facing this, right? I mean, the Aegis battleship, right, can now just about be replicated with open software. I mean, many Ukrainian firms are now designing what are in effect advanced battle management systems for pennies on the dollar. So this is the new reality of democratized technology that's gone global.
Which is quite chilling. On the CRISPR front, the arguments of many scientists, including guests we've had on the show, is the need for international agreements. The Russians, the Chinese, the Americans about not going certain places with this technology. You think there's a need also when it comes to AI, Chris, for the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the Saudis, the Western Europeans to sit around a table and hammer out international agreements on what they will and won't do, perhaps not sending robots into war, so that we really will be in the future?
Well, there is a movement that called Stop Killer Robots that comes out of the Bay Area that's very focused on preventing the use of AI-driven autonomy in weapon systems. And on the one hand, it's very understandable, right? I mean, these are horrific weapons that do horrific things to humans. But history is an important teacher here, as is the whole literature on strategic stability. Nuclear weapons have it's counterintuitive, right? But they've actually, in a strange way, made the global system more stable because nobody actually wants to begin a nuclear war with another advanced state. And it's not yet clear whether the proliferation of autonomous weapons driven by AI will make the world more stable or less stable. But this is indeed something that we ought to be focused on. But the other thing that history teaches us is, nuclear weapons were quite easy to control because of the components, the extremely advanced engineering that has to go into creating the trigger mechanisms, among other things. And that's not true with software, right? Software, the three of us, again, could find a garage somewhere and probably do just about anything. And so that's a very different reality to contend with and to think about from a policy perspective.
Because it is worth noting that most of our audience will need reminding that the US is the only country in the world that has used nuclear weapons. How dangerous, Raj, do you view this world of rogue innovators, of some smart kids somewhere, perhaps in Afghanistan or Iraq or London or New York, able to build new technologies using CRISPR or AI to actually blow the world up? I mean, these have always been the narratives of science fiction or Hollywood movies, but how close are we to that?
Yeah, look, I think the democratization or distribution of these capabilities is a worrisome trend. Right? The cost of building many of these capabilities has dropped precipitously, and we've seen examples of that in cybersecurity, where certain attacks have been and worms have been let out accidentally. Look, I think it all comes down to the fact that war is a terrible thing. We should deter it, and sometimes the best way to deter it is to help potential adversaries, both nation states as well as smaller groups or individuals, realize that it's not in their interest to do so. And so I think that's really at the crux of this conversation and the work that Chris and I got to do for Secretary Carter in the building, the Pentagon.
Although that kind of goes with, I don't think guys of your intellectual abilities need to say that. I mean, it kind of goes without saying. We're talking the weekend of November 2nd and 3rd before the election. I know you guys aren't necessarily political, but if Trump wins, there's lots of there was a Wall Street, a Washington Post headline today about his Elon Musk's plan. Musk now is strong backer of Trump to cut $2 trillion in U.S. spending. And there are all these rumors that if Trump wins, he'll decimate DC bureaucracy. Chris, do you think that if Trump was to win, even something like Unit X might get swept away, and companies like SpaceX and Palantir might essentially become the Pentagon? In the thinking of people like Musk, there's no need to have a Pentagon anymore.
I think what I would say is that we are facing structural challenges in our Defense Department in terms of how the department actually works, the weapon systems it buys, and there's going to have to be a growing consensus about changing that. And there is a bipartisan consensus today, but it's going to take presidential leadership, right, to move dollars and move budgets out of some congressional districts and into others if we want the Pentagon to actually shift. And so what I worry about in terms of this election, no matter who gets elected, is that we as a nation are going to spend all of our political bandwidth talking about other things, even in the face of Ukraine, even in the face of what drones are doing today to the Middle East and to the Red Sea. And in a sense, we could be in danger of being asleep at the switch, of having this incredible window, right, of watching a new way of war unfold before us, and then not choosing to do anything about it. And that, if it happens, could really come to haunt us at a later point.
Do you agree? You're nodding, Raj. I mean, there are isolationists in America now, particularly associated with Trump, who would say, well, why do we need these weapons? We don't want to be involved in Afghanistan or Iraq or Ukraine or Gaza. These are not, these shouldn't and never should be killing fields for young American men. You were in Afghanistan, you were in Iraq, you know the horror, the tragedy of foreign wars.
There's a famous Churchill quote that he once said that you can always trust America to do the right thing, after they've tried everything else. And sometimes I wonder if we're going to try everything else.
Although, when Churchill made that remark in the 30s or 40s, I guess it was the 40s, things moved a little slower. If you make mistakes these days, things change so quickly, it can be much more disastrous. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I echo Chris, right? I'm hopeful, no matter how the election turns out, that the next administration focuses on what's really important. And while we've had some terrible wars, we've had relative peace in the world, at least from a long historical perspective, since the Second World War, right? And so how do we help continue that?
Well, you guys know better than most that timing is everything. We all know that in Silicon Valley. And I think the timing, when I was talking to Andrew Hill, I said, this book is timed perfectly because every headline seems to touch on new relationship between Pentagon and Silicon Valley. So have you, either of you, prepared your victory speech for, what is it, early? Are you going to London for the ceremony in early December?
We're very much looking forward to be hosted by the Financial Times on the 9th of December. And it's been phenomenal to actually read some of the other books, Andrew, to listen to your podcast with some of the other authors. What a celebration of ideas that all have tremendous relevance to our lives.
Raj, you got your victory speech? Who did all the writing for this book? Was it a genuine partnership? I'm always dubious of co-authored books. I always assume someone does the heavy lifting and the other person sits there, drinks their cups of tea, and is happy with the outcome.
Chris and I have had a long partnership. We, even before DIUX officially launched, the 2.0 launched with us, we've been spending time in DC. So we have a long history. And I think when you're building things with people, you have to have high levels of trust and engagement. And we've done that over the years. And that hopefully is shown through in the book as well.
Well, as I said, I think timing is everything. The book is perfectly positioned in this horse race to win the big event, Unit X, how the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are transforming the future of war. If there is a timely book, this is it, by Raj M. Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff. Chris and Raj, thank you so much. Wonderfully important conversation, in some ways depressing, very stimulating. And given that you're both local, we'll have to get you back on the show. Maybe we'll do something live because this issue is certainly not going away. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.